This is MSI's latest 32-inch QD-OLED gaming monitor. It's the MPG 322UR X24, which represents a pretty major update to their 32-inch 4K 240Hz OLED monitor lineup, with a new panel and a range of enhancements, improvements and new features for this year. The new 2026 QD-OLED panel offers improved brightness, a new film which improves blacks and handles ambient lighting better, and to go along with that, MSI have added a range of new monitor features, including the addition of their AI care sensor on a 32-inch model for the first time, and even things like a newly added VRR anti-flicker mode too. So there's loads of updates and improvements which we'll talk through in this video, along with all of our usual in-depth testing. MSI have released a lot of different 32-inch OLED monitors over the last couple of years across their MPG and MAG series screens, with some incremental updates with each model change. Both MPG and MAG series have, until now, all used the same Gen 3 QD-OLED panel with a 4K resolution and 240Hz refresh rate. Their original model was released in Q1 2024, and since then we've seen a curved version added, a white design version, and then a refresh last year to add full-speed DisplayPort 2.1 connectivity as well. Alongside those releases, there's generally been MAG series equivalents as well, with the main difference being a lower spec USB-C port, no USB-A data ports, and a few other minor feature changes compared with the MPG models. Think of those as slightly trimmed down versions at a lower price point. Later on, they also added a couple more affordable MAG series models with a lower 165Hz refresh rate too, for those who perhaps don't want or need a standard 240Hz panel. One of the key updates for the new 2026 models is that it uses, for the first time, an updated 4th Gen Penta Tandem QD-OLED monitor panel from Samsung Display, using their latest OLED material and shifting to a 5-stack structure, which brings improvements to brightness and durability compared with previous Gen 3 panels of this size, which were produced a couple of years back in 2024. This new panel allows SDR and HDR brightness improvements, including a bump from 250 nits to 300 nits for SDR, and certification under the higher tier VESA Display HDR 500 True Black tier for this new model, instead of the True Black 400 tier, which was used on all of the models before. This new QD-OLED panel also offers a new film coating option from Samsung Display, which they call Quantum Black Film, but which MSI market under the brand name of Dark Armor Film. That film improves panel hardness and scratch resistance by 2.5 times, while also doing a good job of improving black depth and contrast in brighter room conditions. We found that this does a nice job of eliminating the purple tint that you can see in brighter room conditions, and perceptually it remains darker, which is a positive change. It still remains semi-glossy like earlier QD-OLED panels, with the same sharp and clear image and pretty decent reflection handling as well, but the additional film helps in these other areas very nicely. We've seen this Dark Armor film on their latest 34-inch ultra-wide model as well, which we reviewed at the start of the year, and it's now being used in this latest 32-inch screen as well, which is great to see and a good update compared with the previous 32-inch models in their range. WOLED technology panels perform better in brighter room conditions still, as you still get some raising of the blacks on QD-OLED, as you can see here, and the difference is especially evident if you compare it to the latest tandem WOLED panels, which offer really deep blacks in even bright room conditions. Still, this is certainly a welcome change and a nice improvement to this year's QD-OLED monitor panels. A lot of the screen specs are familiar, including a 4K resolution and 240Hz refresh rate, but MSI have now also added a selection of new features that we've not seen before, but that we've been asking for a while actually in our previous reviews. In time for launch, that will include a new OLED Anti-Flicker Pro setting, which is already listed on the product page for the screen, but it will help to reduce flicker in VRR gaming situations, although unfortunately at the time of our testing, firmware for this feature was not available. We've seen similar features from other brands, so we've been suggesting for a while now that MSI should look to add this as a similar feature to their screens, and we're told that a firmware update during May should add this function, so if we have a chance to test it separately, we'll pin a comment below where you can find the results. There's also a new dynamic brightness option in the menu for SDR to go along with other recently added functions like better customization control with gamma, color saturation, and 6-axis color adjustment. Those are all available in the menu now alongside this new dynamic SDR brightness. That new SDR brightness option allows you to disable the uniform brightness if you want to in order to boost brightness for dynamic SDR content. That's as long as you're happy to live with some ABL dimming and variable brightness, but that's going to be a lot less noticeable in those kind of instances anyway. It's a feature that we've seen from competing brands, and it's really good to see MSI listening to feedback and suggestions and enhancing their feature set on their new OLED monitors. In uniform mode, we measured a decent improvement in SDR luminance compared with their previous gen 32-inch QD-OLED monitors, reaching just over 300 nits now and offering a 30% increase in luminance compared with the original model and panel from a couple of years ago. It's also basically the same as the other 4th gen QD-OLED monitor of this size that we've tested earlier this year from ASUS, which uses the same 32-inch panel. Remember also that as a result of the much higher contrast from an OLED panel, the perceived brightness of this display would be equivalent to an approximate 510 nits LCD, and so this panel would reach the True Bright 500 certification tier. If you want to know loads more about the theory and data behind that and their certification, check out our article link below. If you switch to the dynamic brightness mode, the screen can reach up to around 432 nits maximum now, although as we said, you'd have to live with some ABL dimming as the content changes and the scenes get brighter. Like we said, it's good to see this as a new option now on this new MSI OLED monitor, and we think this could be useful for SDR gaming and multimedia. This is also their first 32-inch QD-OLED monitor to include their recently launched AI Care Sensor feature to go along with their already very extensive collection of OLED care settings and options in the menu. The sensor intelligently detects usage and can turn the screen off when you move away from it, back on when you return, and even do fancy things like dim the screen when it detects you're looking away, or also act as an ambient light sensor to dynamically adjust the brightness at different times of the day. That's included here on this new 32-inch MPG model for the first time in this size range. This screen has a familiar design as with their previous OLED monitors, although there's an additional chin on the bottom edge where the care sensor is now housed. MSI have included the latest connectivity options as well, including full-speed DisplayPort 2.1 with UHBR20 speeds, a USB Type-C connection with a high 98 watts power delivery, and 2 HDMI 2.1 ports. There's also 2 USB-A data ports and a headphone jack on the back of the screen. Functions like a KVM switch and picture-in-picture and picture-by-picture are supported for handling multiple systems and input sources, so it's got all of the key modern features that you might hope to find. The stand provides tilt, height and swivel adjustments, which are all pretty smooth and easy to use. There's no rotate function offered here though for some reason, and note that there's no integrated speakers on this screen. Let's get into some of our other testing then, and we'll start with the gaming performance. The OLED panel offers the usual near instant response times that we'd expect to see from this technology, and it's reaching the stage really where it's a little bit unnecessary to even measure these on OLED monitors, to be honest. Motion clarity is the same as other 240Hz OLED panels that we've tested before. You can find faster OLED refresh rates now, which give you an additional improvement in clarity and gaming experience, but most users will likely be perfectly fine with 240Hz anyway. That's going to be a challenge to power at 4K resolution, of course, and motion clarity is still really impressive. If you're a serious competitive gamer, you may perhaps want to consider a smaller screen size, lower resolution and higher refresh rate combination, like for instance maybe MSI's 500Hz QD-OLED monitors. The 4K resolution here provides a super sharp and clear image for highly detailed games, and it gives you a larger, more immersive screen size too. MSI provide a black frame insertion mode on this screen, like they have on other recent OLED monitors in their lineup, currently labelled as MPRT in the on-screen menu, but soon to be rebranded in a future firmware update to SLMB, or Super Low Motion Blur, which we think is a better, more descriptive name for this feature, to be honest. This operates the same as previous MSI OLED monitors that we've tested, and it's available here when you're set at 240Hz and 180Hz only, and it will disable VRR when you turn it on, as it can only operate at fixed refresh rates as normal for current OLED monitor BFI implementations. As we've talked about in the past, MSI's implementation of this feature is a little confusing, creates a bit of extra config work for PC gaming, and it also unfortunately leaves a gap for console usage. When you enable it at 240Hz, the screen starts to drop half the frames for black frames, so it's actually rendering at 120 FPS now, with black frames used for the other 120 FPS. That helps improve the motion clarity very nicely for situations where you can only power games up to 120 FPS, reaching 240Hz levels without the demands on your system, which is really good. Because the system is still set to 240Hz though, if you're rendering over 120 FPS from your game, some frames will be dropped in favour of the black frames, so you might want to consider capping your frame rate manually to avoid that. There's an added complication there compared with competing OLED monitors, where you usually have to manually set Windows refresh rate to the lower level first. Because of the way it operates, it's unfortunately not possible to use this function from a games console either, as the maximum 120Hz input doesn't support the BFI mode, and you have to send a 240Hz signal for it to operate at that frequency, which is a shame for console gamers. The maximum luminance that you can reach in this mode is very typical for a QD-OLED monitor, although if you switch to the dynamic brightness mode, you can get a bit of a boost compared to the uniform mode. And the ABL dimming that's introduced there is probably not going to be very noticeable in gaming situations where you'd be using the MPRT feature anyway. One annoyance is that the brightness control is not remembered independently between the off and the on modes, so you'll likely have to change that every time, which is a bit of a pain. There's a small lag penalty of a few milliseconds when you enable this feature, but it could be useful for PC gaming situations where your system can only manage up to 120 FPS, but you want to get a decent motion clarity boost. We'd like to see some updates in the future to allow this to be used with 120Hz consoles if possible. There's a great range of gaming extras and settings on the screen like on their previous OLED monitors. As we've mentioned earlier, MSI are also going to be adding a VRR anti-flicker function in the near future via a firmware update, which is good news. It unfortunately wasn't available to test at the time of this review, so we'll have to see how that performs at a later date. Regardless, for now, we found the VRR flicker to be at low levels on the screen, with a little detected in darker scenes, but overall nothing too severe. Being a QD-OLED panel, the gamma is not directly tied to the frame rate, and so flickering behaves a little bit differently to WOLED technology panels. You get consistent spikes of flicker in terms of their amplitude, but the frequency of those spikes increases as your frame rate lowers. So the trick with QD-OLED panels is to try and keep frame rates not only consistent, but also as high as possible to reduce the frequency of any spikes. Situations where you cross the LFC boundary can also cause noticeable flicker at the lower end of the refresh rate range, but overall on this screen, we thought the flicker levels were good. Input lag was super low as well, basically nothing at the native refresh rate, and only marginally higher for the lower fixed refresh rates like 120Hz and 60Hz, which was great news. Like we said a minute ago, the MPRT mode adds a few milliseconds of lag overall. Console support was very good with a native 4K resolution and 120Hz support for modern consoles, and full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports provided. There's VRR support and an HDMI CEC function which are useful, but note that there's no integrated speakers on this model. The only other gaps really are 4K 24Hz movie playback and Dolby Vision HDR, but the latter is very rare in the monitor market, to be honest. HDR10 support is perfectly fine anyway for console gaming, with the OLED panel supporting HDR content very well. In other testing, the screen has a very accurate default setup in the native user mode, with a very accurate gamma and grayscale, which was impressive. MSI have recently expanded their user controls in the menu, offering control now over the gamma level as well as color temp and color settings, which is great to see. The native color space of the screen is very wide, extending a significant way beyond the sRGB reference space, and therefore resulting in poor color accuracy for sRGB and SDR content, but that's normal and expected for any wide gamut screen. We'll look at ways to more accurately work with SDR content in a moment. The color gamut more closely matches the DCI-P3 reference, a color space often used for HDR content, and so we had good color accuracy for DCI-P3 colors. You can see that the native gamut stretches a little bit beyond the DCI-P3 reference as well, with 112% relative coverage. MSI provide 3 emulation modes in the menu for sRGB, DCI-P3 and Adobe RGB. The sRGB mode could be useful for standard SDR content, and it's got a very reliable setup and factory calibration. The gamma here is configured to a slightly different sRGB gamma instead of the normal 2.2, but that does help bring out some near black shades and makes darker content a little bit better and easier to see. We'll look at shadow detail in more detail in a moment. The main benefit of this mode is that it clamps the wide native colour space back to sRGB for more accurate SDR colours. The clamping is very good here, and you retain access in the menu to adjust the brightness, gamma control and colour temperature preset, although you do lose access to the RGB levels in this mode. Not that you really need to use them, as the default 6500K temp is very accurate here. The DCI-P3 mode is a similar story, although this one is configured back to 2.2 gamma, and it retains a nice accurate grayscale and colour temp. The clamping in this mode back to the DCI-P3 reference is also very good, removing most of the overcoverage that we'd seen in the native mode and leaving us with a very good colour accuracy for DCI-P3 colours. Pure red is the only slight issue, as the colour space of the panel doesn't quite cover that full area, but it's very close. Helpfully, MSI also provide an Adobe RGB emulation mode for those who might want to work with this colour space for photography applications. This is again very nicely configured with an accurate gamma and grayscale and good clamping of the colour space back to the target Adobe RGB. That gives us very good colour accuracy as well for Adobe RGB content. All of the main modes on this screen are very well calibrated and offer some excellent performance and great flexibility in settings. MSI have done a really good job there, we think. We also calibrated the screen ourselves, which produced excellent results, and you can find a link below to our best settings guide along with our calibrated ICC profile if you want to try that out. That can be used with the native user mode, and it will clamp the colour space back to sRGB for colour aware applications. Near black shadow detail was also good on this screen, with good gamma calibration in the user mode, and the first visible grey shade was RGB3. The same results apply basically to all of the other modes except the sRGB mode, which, as we said earlier, is actually configured to the slightly different sRGB gamma, which makes darker content brighter, and it makes the near black detail a little bit easier to see as well. That's a potentially useful option for darker SDR content if needed. Unlike WOLED technology panels, these results remain consistent at different refresh rates, and there's no gamma shift, which is good news. The AI vision setting in the menu acts as a black stabilizer type adjustment, and that could be useful for gaming situations if you want to make darker scenes a bit brighter still. There's 5 modes available which seem to enhance shadow detail to varying degrees without raising the black point, which is great news. Those could be useful in some situations. This new 4th Gen Penta Tandem QD-OLED panel for 2026 keeps the same triangular layout of subpixels as the previous 32-inch 4K panel, so there's no change there, no shift to an RGB stripe like we saw on the 34-inch panel, but with the high pixel density of 140 ppi, there's very little text fringing here, and the text clarity problems that impact lower density panels should be eliminated here for the vast majority of users. The standard semi-glossy coating of the QD-OLED panel provides a really sharp and clear image, while also retaining some decent anti-reflective properties, which is very useful in brighter rooms, and it handles reflections better than competing glossy WOLED panels that are available. The spectral distribution of the panel is shown here at a calibrated 6500K white point, and that's typical for a modern QD-OLED panel. MSI also provide a low blue light mode with a simple on-off switch, which makes the image warmer and could be used for a lot of text work or using the screen at night perhaps. There's also another new setting in the menu called corner uniformity, which we tried out. This seems to be designed to operate a dimming mechanism for around the edges of the panel in the lower modes. The default maximum setting is level 4, and we measured excellent panel luminance uniformity across the whole screen. If you drop it down to the lowest level 1 setting, the luminance around the edges, and especially in the corners, drops massively by up to 68% in fact, and where the middle of the screen is calibrated to 200 nits in this example, the corners drop down to around 119 nits. This introduces a noticeable vignetting effect to the image, and we're not really sure why anyone would really ever want to use this setting or for what purpose it's been introduced. The default level 4 is great, just leave it on that. When it comes to HDR performance, the QD-OLED panel offers the usual hardware level capabilities such as per pixel level dimming control, which avoids halos and blooming, and a potentially infinite contrast ratio with the ability to turn off individual pixels. It's really well suited to HDR gaming and movies. The new dark armor film helps with the perceived black depth in brighter room conditions, which is a welcome improvement to this new Gen 4 panel, although optimal performance is still in a darker room. There's 3 main HDR modes available to choose from, which are True Black 500, Peak 1000 nits, and the EOTF Boost mode, a setting which was not originally available on their earlier 32-inch OLED monitors, but which was added later via a firmware update. This new MSI screen also gives you access to adjust the brightness setting if you want in HDR mode, if you find it perhaps too bright, for instance, in certain situations, although there's no control over other settings like colours while using the HDR mode. MSI have also introduced 2 new HDR modes which allow you to customise the EOTF curve and luminance in both the True Black 500 and the Peak 1000 mode. They can't increase the brightness of the screen, they're more used to impact the ABL dimming behaviour, but if you wanted to try and obtain a setup perhaps somewhere in between the True Black 500 and the Peak modes, you could use those modes if you want, but we think most people will probably want to stick with something like the EOTF Boost mode for the best balance between brightness and accuracy. Each of the 3 main modes behaves slightly differently, which we'll go through in a bit more detail here. Peak white luminance reached up to the advertised 1000 nits when using the Peak 1000 and EOTF Boost modes, but it's capped to around 500 nits when using the True Black 500 mode. That's a mode that's designed really to pass the VESA Display HDR certification process, and because it doesn't reach as bright, you see less noticeable panel dimming in this mode as the scenes change. But we think most people will probably want to use one of the other modes for a more impactful HDR peak brightness performance. Thanks to the new 4th Gen panel and their EL 3.0 material, the peak white luminance is around 13% higher than the previous 3rd Gen panels of this size from 2024 in most scenes, although the peak brightness remains limited to 1000 nits. We've seen their latest 34-inch ultra-wide panels reaching a higher 1300 nits brightness, so it is a little bit of a shame that the same improvements aren't being offered here on the 32-inch panel update, although the higher pixel density makes that more challenging. Peak white luminance isn't the only factor though, and the EOTF tracking also needs to be considered, as this impacts accuracy and image detail in HDR content. The True Black 500 mode shows the most consistent performance across different scenes, but surprisingly, there appears to be a fairly significant roll-off in mid to light shades still, which causes some over-darkening of the image, and it's therefore not as bright as it perhaps should be. We'd seen this same tuning on their 34-inch model as well earlier in the year. The Peak 1000 mode shows more drastic darkening in overall brighter scenes and those higher APL scenes, and in practice, this mode ends up looking darker than the True Black 500 mode, despite its ability to reach a much higher peak white luminance. You get some brighter highlights in darker scenes, but overall the experience is considerably darker in real use than the True Black 500 mode. That's very common on QD-OLED monitors and something that we've explored in a lot of detail in the past. The EOTF Boost mode has been added to several of MSI's new screens and retrospectively also added to some of their older models via a firmware update. That's designed to try and dynamically improve the brightness of the Peak 1000 mode, offering, in theory, the capability to reach the 1000 nits peak brightness in dark scenes without the excessive darkening and dimming in other brighter scenes. This isn't always easy to capture with standard test patterns and measurements, and you can see here that it looks like it might be the same as the Peak 1000 mode in these tests, but in real world content it is brighter, and these side-by-side comparisons hopefully capture that a little bit better. We can also take some measurements in real HDR scenes to compare the 3 modes, and you can see here that the Peak 1000 mode is considerably darker than the True Black 500 mode, by around 77% lower luminance in fact on average. The EOTF Boost mode is better and looks brighter, but it still remains around 37% lower luminance on average than the True Black 500 mode in most scenes. It can reach much brighter for peak highlights in overall darker, low APL scenes, but it's not quite as bright generally. It sits somewhere in between the True Black and Peak 1000 modes in overall brightness we found. We can also compare the real scene brightness against the ASUS equivalent model, which we've also reviewed. And ASUS's screen reaches around 17% higher luminance in the equivalent mode, which is called Gaming HDR on that screen. We're only talking about 30 to 40 nits here, so it's a minor difference, and both models look pretty similar in side-by-side comparisons. Perhaps the EOTF boost mode could be adjusted to brighten some scenes more than it is right now, to bring it in line a little bit more with the True Black 500 mode, although if you overbrighten too much, you start to lose detail, which is also not ideal. In other tests, the screen showed a nice accurate grayscale and colour temp, and a good white point too, which was great news. Shadow detail is also good in HDR mode, with the first visible grey shade being RGB3 in our testing. The full native gamma at the screen remains active during HDR mode, giving decent coverage of the DCI-P3 and Rec 2020 colour spaces, and we had very good colour accuracy for HDR content as well. The MPG 322UR X24 is a decent upgrade to MSI's previous 32-inch 4K QD-OLED monitors, offering a range of improvements and new features. Not enough to warrant an upgrade if you're an existing owner of one of their early models, but if you're in the market for a new 32-inch OLED monitor, then this offers some really nice updates that are definitely worth having. The updated 4th Gen Penta Tandem QD-OLED panel offers some improvements to brightness in both SDR and HDR, along with some expected lifespan improvements, but most noticeable is the addition of MSI's dark armor film, which does a nice job of improving black depth and coating hardness. It's good to see the more modern features added here as well, including DisplayPort 2.1, their AI care sensor, and even some new menu options like their dynamic brightness mode, better customization options, and their upcoming VRR anti-flicker setting, which will hopefully work well. This screen is due to be released during the next couple of months at the pricing shown here. MSI also have an MAG series model coming soon using this new 4th Gen QD-OLED panel, but there's some differences in the feature set and spec between that and this higher tier MPG version. Most notably, the MAG model doesn't have DP 2.1, it's got a lower power delivery from the USB-C port, and it's got no USB-A, KVM switch, AI care sensor or ambient light sensor either. It's basically a trimmed down feature set which will be available at a lower price point. That's potentially an attractive option though if you decide you don't want or need some of those extra features and you want to save a little bit more money. That MAG model is due to be released in Q2, Q3 depending on region, and we'll provide affiliate links below for both models once we see them become available, so you can check out latest pricing and availability below for your region. Do let us know in the comments section below if you're thinking of buying either of these screens, or if you've got your eye on a different OLED monitor this year. And if you want to stay up to date on all of the latest monitor news, reviews and information, don't forget to hit subscribe. Thanks for watching, we'll catch you next time.